Calvin Rhodes went to his bank. The employee did something that surprised everyone. "Hey everyone, today I've got a story you won't believe. What happens when a powerful CEO walks into his own bank dressed like an everyday customer and no one recognizes him? Not just that. What if the very people meant to serve him treat him like he doesn't belong? Calvin Rhodes built his financial empire from nothing, but when he walked into one of his own branches, what he experienced shook him to the core. What he discovered that day would not only change how his bank operates, but would expose a deeper truth about how we judge others by what they wear, not who they are. Stick around, because what happens next will leave you stunned. What happens when a CEO goes undercover at his own company and gets shut out? Calvin Rhodes, Shaq had built his business from the ground up, born into modest beginnings. He had never known privilege, only the struggle for success. Decades of hard work, determination, and smart decisions had turned his small startup into one of the leading banks in the country, from a humble college student rejected time and time again to the man whose name was now known in the financial world. Calvin Rhodes' Shaq had seen it all. However, as of late, a gnawing feeling had started to plague him. He was hearing rumors about his bank, rumors of customers being treated unfairly, of their complaints being ignored. Calvin Rhodes' Shaq knew the importance of customer service, and he had always prided himself on his company's reputation, so he decided to do something bold. Go undercover, no cameras, no special treatment, just him and his employees, in their most honest form. Calvin Rhodes' Shaq entered his closet one morning. His hand hovered over the tailored suits, the silk ties, the polished shoes that he usually wore today, though he chose something different. He pulled out an old navy polo shirt and a pair of worn jeans. Nothing about this outfit screamed CEO, no designer labels, no symbols of power. He left his Rolex on the nightstand and slipped into a pair of well-worn sneakers. This would be his disguise. A regular customer he called a cab, avoiding his usual private driver, and made his way to one of the branches. The city of Chicago bustled outside, with businessmen rushing to meetings and tourists snapping photos. But inside the cab, Calvin Rhodes' Shaq's mind raced. Would this be worth it? Would he find what he feared, or would the complaints turn out to be isolated incidents? The cab pulled up to the bank, a modern glass building nestled between a cafe and an insurance office. Calvin Rhodes' Shaq paid. The driver took a deep breath and stepped out. As he walked through the glass doors, he was greeted by the familiar scent of freshly printed receipts and cleaning supplies, but the feeling in the air was different. It was cold, impersonal. Calvin Rhodes' Shaq took a few steps inside and surveyed the scene. A handful of customers sat at desks or waited in line. Posters on the walls promoted various investment options and savings plans. Calvin Rhodes' Shaq paused for a moment. Not a single employee acknowledged him. At first he thought it was just his imagination. Maybe they were busy. But as he glanced over at the Linda Keene, a middle-aged woman with glasses who was typing away on her computer, nothing changed. She didn't look up. Calvin Rhodes' Shaq waited for a smile, a nod, or even the smallest recognition. Nothing. Then another customer, a man in a sharp suit, entered immediately. The Linda Keene's demeanor changed. She straightened up, smiled, and greeted him warmly. Calvin Rhodes. Shaq felt his stomach churn as he watched the man being directed to a Megan Porter. Almost immediately he clenched his jaw but forced himself to remain calm. Was this just a fluke? Maybe the Linda Keene was distracted. Calvin Rhodes' Shaq decided to test the waters further. He approached a young Megan Porter who was finishing up with a customer. He waited patiently, hands in his pockets. A well-dressed couple at the next counter were being treated with full attention, smiles, and detailed explanations. When it was Calvin Rhodes' Shaq's turn, the Megan Porter barely glanced up from her computer screen. "What do you need?" she asked with a disinterested tone. Calvin Rhodes' Shaq gave her a polite smile. "I'd like to open a new high-value account." The Megan Porter sighed, clearly irritated. "You need an appointment for that?" She responded, still not looking at him. Calvin Rhodes' Shack frowned. I checked your website. It said, Walker welcome for new accounts. The Megan Porter barely glanced at him. Yeah, well, not for those kinds of accounts. Calvin Rhodes' Shack looked at another customer at the next counter. The Megan Porter was smiling patiently, walking him. Through various account options, Calvin Rhodes' Shack turned back to the Megan Porter. So just to be clear, if I look different, dressed differently, you'd be treating me differently right now, wouldn't you? The Megan Porter blinked, her expression tightened, and she snapped, That's not what I said, Calvin Rhodes. Shack tilted his head. It's what you're doing. She exhaled sharply, clearly annoyed. Maybe another Gerald Price would be better for what you're looking for. Calvin Rhodes' Shack's frustration grew, but he wasn't here to lash out. He needed answers. He needed to understand what was happening in his own company. Calvin Rhodes' Shack took a deep breath and decided to play along all right. He said, his voice calm, Maybe I just need some information. Can you tell me about your business account options? The Megan Porter sighed again without a word. She reached under the counter and pulled out a crumpled brochure. She slid it across the counter with little enthusiasm. Calvin Rhodes' Shack picked it up, flipped through it, and already knew the content by heart. But that wasn't the point across the room. Another customer. A well-dressed older man approached a different Megan Porter and asked the exact same question. The response was night and day. The Megan Porter leaned forward, smiling, explaining the options in detail. Calvin Rhodes' Shack felt a surge of frustration, but kept his composure. Is there someone I can speak with about account recommendations? The Megan Porter's lips pressed into a thin line that would be the Gerald Pricer, she said flatly. Calvin Rhodes' Shack nodded. Great, I'd like to speak with him. She hesitated, then with a small smirk, said, He's busy. Calvin Rhodes' Shack raised an eyebrow. Did you check the Megan Porter didn't answer? Instead, she turned to the next customer in line, effectively dismissing him. Calvin Rhodes' Shack stood there for a moment, a growing sense of disbelief washing over him. It wasn't just bad service, it was intentional. He glanced around the bank, watching how others were treated. The ones who looked important were treated with courtesy, patience, and respect. But him, he was invisible. But Calvin Rhodes' Shack wasn't leaving yet, not until he understood what was going on. Calvin Rhodes' Shack walked past the Megan Porter and headed towards the back of the Gerald Price. Where the Gerald Price's office was, the door was slightly ajar, and through the glass he saw the Gerald Price, an older man in a gray suit, sipping coffee while scrolling through his phone. Calvin Rhodes' Shack knocked lightly on the frame. The Gerald Price barely glanced up. Can I help you? Yes, Calvin. Rhodes' Shack said, I was told I need an appointment to open a high-value account, but I just watched 2 other customers get full service with no issues. The Gerald Price finally looked up, gaze flickered over Calvin Rhodes' Shack's plain attire, the worn sneakers and the lack of designer labels. His expression shifted into a polite but firm smile, the kind that said, I'd rather not deal with you right now. If you'd like to apply for an account, I suggest you try one of our other branches, the Gerald Price said smoothly. Calvin Rhodes' Shack took a slow breath. Why would I need to go to another Gerald Price when I'm already at one of my own? The Gerald Price's expression didn't change. He paused. It's just a matter of Calvin Rhodes' Shack reached into his pocket and pulled out his executive ID. He placed it on the Gerald Price's desk. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. The Gerald Price's face went pale. Mr. Calvin Rhodes' Shack. Calvin Rhodes' Shack tilted his head. I didn't realize he said, his voice cold. You didn't realize what the Linda Keene and Megan Porter, who had ignored him earlier, suddenly became very, very interested in their keyboards, avoiding eye contact. The tension in the room thickened. Calvin Rhodes' Shack's voice was calm, but carried the weight of authority. You didn't realize I was someone who mattered. The Gerald Price opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Calvin Rhodes' Shack leaned, in slightly his gaze unyielding. Tell me, if I hadn't revealed who I was, how would this have ended? Would you have called security? Would you have escorted me? Me out? Made me feel like I wasn't good enough for my own institution. The Gerald Price stammered. Of course not, sir. Calvin Rhodes, Shaq straightened up. But you already did. The weight of Calvin Rhodes, Shaq's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, and the entire Gerald Price seemed to hold its breath. Calvin Rhodes, Shaq didn't speak again. Immediately, he let the silence settle in his eyes. Scanning the room, the Gerald Price stood, frozen. His face still filled with shock. The Megan Porter, who had dismissed him earlier, stood near the counter, arms crossed, avoiding eye contact. Calvin Rhodes. Shaq reached for his phone and made a call. Good morning, Mrs. Tanya Ellish said when his assistant answered. I need an internal audit launched at the Chicago Gerald Price today. And while you're at it, pull every customer complaint filed here in the past. 6 months, get me names, details, everything. The Gerald Price's face went even paler. The employees around the room shifted uncomfortably. Calvin Rhodes. Shaq ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket. You have 1 hour to gather your staff in the conference room. Calvin Rhodes, Shaq said. We're going to have a conversation about what kind of bank this is, and more importantly, what kind of bank it will be moving forward. The Gerald Price hesitated but nodded stiffly. Calvin Rhodes, Shaq turned and left the office. As he walked past the Megan Porter, who had ignored him, he saw her glance at him, and for the first time their eyes met. Change was coming. An hour later, the employees of the Chicago Gerald Price sat nervously around a conference table. The air was thick with discomfort. Calvin Rhodes, Shaq, stood at the head of the table, his hands resting on the polished wood. He wasn't here to yell to fire anyone on the spot, but he was here to make sure they understood the gravity of what had happened. Calvin Rhodes. Shaq let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking. I built this institution from nothing. He began, his voice steady and controlled. Not because I was handed opportunities. Not because doors were open for me. I built it because I fought for it. And the fact that this is happening inside my bank, he shook his head. I will not tolerate it. Some of the staff avoided his gaze. The Gerald Price cleared his throat, but wisely stayed silent. Calvin Rhodes, Shaq continued. I walked into this Gerald Price today as an ordinary C customer. I didn't throw my name around. I didn't expect special treatment. What I did expect, what any customer should expect, is basic respect. He paused, letting the words sink in. What I got instead was excuses, dismissiveness, and barriers thrown in my way for no reason other than someone deciding I wasn't worth their time. Calvin Rhodes, Shaq turned his eyes to the Megan Porter, who had dismissed him earlier. Would you like to explain why you assumed I wasn't here for legitimate business? Her face turned R. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Calvin Rhodes, Shaq nodded. Once that's the problem, isn't it? The room was silent, and then Calvin Rhodes, Shaq shifted gears. I don't run my business based on who looks the part and who doesn't. I run it on trust, on service, and on making sure that when someone walks through those doors, they feel valued. If you can't provide that, you don't belong here. The Megan Porter shifted in her seat. Calvin Rhodes, Shaq turned his gaze toward the Gerald Price. Now here's what's going to happen. Every single one of you is undergoing new training on customer relations, and it won't just be a quick seminar. It's going to make you uncomfortable because that's what change feels like. The Gerald Price opened his mouth to speak, but Calvin Rhodes cut him off. You'll be the first in that training. Leadership starts at the top. The Gerald Price closed his mouth. Calvin Rhodes, Shaq looked around the room. This isn't about punish him. It's about accountability. People deserve better, and from now on, that's exactly what they're going to get. He glanced at the employees and then picked up his phone. A direct email was sent to every Gerald Price statement, a promise, a warning from this moment forward. No one would walk into one of his banks and feel like they didn't belong. Calvin Rhodes, had learned something today. Some lessons hit hard, but the hardest ones, they changed everything. Calvin Rhodes, Shaq didn't speak immediately. He allowed the silence to stretch, making sure every employee in the room felt the weight of what had just transpired. His eyes moved across the room, scanning the nervous faces of the staff. The Gerald Price, frozen in shock, stood there, his expression betraying the tension that had suddenly gripped him. The Linda Keene, who had barely acknowledged him earlier, now stood with her arms crossed, her gaze firmly planted on her shoes. The Megan Porter who had dismissed him, was fidgeting in her chair, avoiding his eye contact. Calvin Rhodes' shack stood tall and unflinching. He reached into his pocket and took out his phone with deliberate precision. He tapped the screen and dialed the number of his executive assistant, Mrs. Tanya Ellis. "Good morning." "Mrs. Tanya Ellis, Calvin Rhodes' shack," said his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "I need an internal audit launched at the Chicago Gerald Price today, and while you're at it, pull every customer complaint filed here in the last 6 months. Want names, details, everything." The Gerald Price's face turned a shade paler as Calvin Rhodes' shack spoke. The other employees shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the gravity of the situation. The room felt tense, as though it were bracing for something that could no longer be avoided. Calvin Rhodes' shack ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, then looked back at the Gerald Price. "You have 1 hour to gather your staff in the conference room. We're going to have a conversation about what kind of bank this is, and more importantly, what kind of bank it will be moving forward." The Gerald Price opened his mouth, but no words came out. He hesitated, and Calvin Rhodes' shack watched as he seemed to weigh his options. Finally, he nodded stiffly, but the look of discomfort on his face was unmistakable. Calvin Rhodes' shack turned his attention to the rest of the staff. "I trust you'll all be in the conference room as well. You can all join us for the conversation." The Linda Keene, the Megan Porter, and even the security guard, who had moved closer, sensing something was wrong, exchanged uneasy glances. Calvin Rhodes' shack didn't wait for another word. He turned and walked out of the office, his steps deliberate, his resolve clear as he passed the Megan Porter who had ignored him earlier. Their eyes met, but Calvin Rhodes' shack didn't say a word. The shift in the atmosphere was palpable now. For the first time, they all realized that the man they had dismissed so easily wasn't. Someone they could ignore. Change was coming, and it was coming fast. Calvin Rhodes' shack walked down the corridor with purpose, knowing that this moment, this confrontation, would be a turning point. Not only for this Gerald Price, but for the entire institution. The employees who had stood by silently would soon learn that Calvin Rhodes' shack's company was built on respect, integrity, and service values that would no longer be compromised. An hour later, the employees filed into the conference room, their faces tense, their bodies stiff. They sat at the long table, and Calvin Rhodes' shack stood at the head of IT, hands resting on the polished wood, his posture commanding and firm. Calvin Rhodes' shack wasn't here to yell or to punish anyone on the spot. He wasn't interested in creating fear, but in instilling accountability. He let the silence stretch before speaking, his voice steady and unwavering. "I built this institution from nothing." He began, meeting the eyes of each employee in turn. "Not because I was handed an opportunity, not because doors were open for me. I built it because I had to fight for it. I know what it's like to be dismissed, to be overlooked, to be made to feel like you don't belong." He paused, letting his words sink in. His gaze moved across the room again, and he saw that some of the staff were avoiding his eyes. He wasn't surprised, but what came next was non-negotiable, and the fact that this is happening inside my bank. Calvin Rhodes' shack shook his head. "I will not tolerate it." The air was thick with discomfort, but Calvin Rhodes' shack's voice didn't waver. "I walked into this Gerald Price today as an ordinary customer. I didn't throw my name around. I didn't expect special treatment. What I did expect, what any customer should expect, is basic respect." He let the words hang in the air, heavy with truth. "What I got instead was excuses, dismissiveness, and barriers thrown in my way for no reason other than someone deciding I wasn't worth their time." Calvin Rhodes' shack turned his eyes to the Megan Porter, who had been the most dismissive. She shifted in her chair, her hands clenched in her lap. Calvin Rhodes, Shaq's gaze didn't falter. Would you like to explain why you assumed I wasn't here for legitimate business? Her face flushed red, but she opened her mouth to speak, and then closed it again. Nothing came out. The room was silent save for the occasional shuffle of feet. Calvin Rhodes gave her a moment before speaking again, his voice quiet, but cutting through the tension. That's the problem, isn't it? You didn't look at me as someone who mattered, and that's exactly what we're here to change. The silence in the room deepened. Calvin Rhodes Shaq's words resonated with everyone, but no one more so than the woman in the chair, her shame written clearly on her face. Calvin Rhodes Shaq let the moment linger before continuing, his tone now shifting. I don't run my business based on who looks the part and who doesn't. I run it on trust, on service, on making sure that when someone walks through those doors, they feel valued. If you can't provide that, then you don't belong here. The weight of the statement was undeniable. A heavy pause followed, and the Gerald Price, who had remained silent up until now, cleared his throat. Wrote Calvin Rhodes. Shaq didn't give him the opportunity to speak further. Now, here's what's going to happen. Calvin Rhodes Shaq continued, his voice firm. Every single one of you is going through new training, customer relations training, and it won't be just a seminar where you nod along and go back to business as usual. It's going to make you uncomfortable because that's what change feels like. The Gerald Price shifted uncomfortably in his chair, ready to protest. But before he could speak, Calvin Rhodes cut him off. You'll be the first in that training. Leadership starts at the top. The Gerald Price went silent, his mouth snapping shut as Calvin Rhodes Shaq's gaze locked on him. Calvin Rhodes Shaq surveyed the room again, meeting the eyes of each employee. The discomfort was palpable, but it was clear that this was a pivotal moment. This isn't about punishment. Calvin Rhodes concluded. It's about accountability. People deserve better, and from now on, that's exactly what they're going to get. He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. Then, with a decisive motion, he reached for his phone again. He tapped out a quick email to every Gerald Price, outlining the changes that were coming and the standards that would be upheld as he pressed send. Calvin Rhodes looked around the room, making sure every person understood from this moment forward no one would walk into one of his banks and feel like they didn't belong, not on his watch. An hour later, the employees gathered in the conference room, their faces tense with unease. The room, typically filled with chatter and casual conversation, was now thick with discomfort. Calvin Rhodes Shaq stood at the head of the table, his posture unyielding, his eyes scanning each individual who had gathered. There, he wasn't here to yell, to berate anyone, but he was here to ensure that they understood the gravity of what had just unfolded and what would be expected. Moving forward, the air hung heavy as if every breath was held waiting for Calvin Rhodes Shaq's next words. He let the silence stretch, watching his employees. Some of them avoided his gaze, their eyes darting to the table, the walls, the floor, anywhere but meeting his eyes. The Gerald Price, who had tried to deflect Calvin Rhodes Shaq's questioning earlier, stood stiffly at the far end of the table, his face still flushed from the shock of the earlier encounter. The Linda Keene and the Megan Porter, who had ignored him earlier, sat uncomfortably, their hands clenched in their laps, their postures rigid. Calvin Rhodes Shaq wasn't one to rush. He wasn't going to speak until they were all acutely aware of what this moment represented. Finally, when the silence had stretched to a point where it became impossible to ignore, he spoke. I built this institution from nothing. Big Shaq's voice was steady, unyielding. Not because I was handed opportunities, not because doors were open for me. I built it because I had to fight for it every step of the way. I had to prove that I belonged, that I was worth it, and I know what it feels like to be dismissed, to be ignored, to be made to feel like you don't matter. And now, here in my own bank, I've watched it happen. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. His gaze moved around the room, and Fact that it's happening here, the fact that employees in my own institution are treating customers this way, I won't tolerate it, not for a second. Not in my name. Calvin Rhodes' Shack's voice did not rise in anger, but it carried with it an authority that was impossible to ignore. I walked into this Gerald Price today as just another customer. I didn't throw my name around. I didn't expect special treatment. But I did expect one thing: basic respect. What I got instead was excuses, disrespect, dismissal. His eyes locked on the Megan Porter, who had been the most dismissive, the one who had sighed and rolled her eyes, as if his request for assistance had been an inconvenience. You refused to help me, and now you're sitting here in front of me hoping this all blows over. I want to know why the Megan Porter shifted uncomfortably, her face flushing as she opened her mouth to speak, but quickly closing it when she realized she didn't have an answer that could justify her actions. The room was so quiet you could hear the collective breath being held by the other employees. Calvin Rhodes' Shack continued unwavering. That's the problem. The assumption that someone who looks like me, someone who doesn't fit a certain image, isn't worthy of the service we provide. I don't care if a customer is dressed in a tuxedo or in sneakers like mine, they all deserve the same level of respect, the same quality of service. Calvin Rhodes' Shack's gaze moved to the Linda Keene, who was nervously tapping her pen on the table, and you, too. I walked into this Gerald Price, and not a single person acknowledged me. Not until another well-dressed customer walked in, and then suddenly you noticed him. Why, the Linda Keene stammered, but Calvin Rhodes' Shack didn't give her a chance to make excuses. This kind of behavior, this is not acceptable, not in my company, not in any company that prides itself on service, on inclusion, on treating people with dignity. If you can't see that, if you can't provide that, then maybe you don't belong here. There was a long silence in the room, the weight of Calvin Rhodes' Shack's words hanging heavy. The Gerald Price, who had been standing at the back of the room, finally cleared his throat, but before he could say anything, Calvin Rhodes' Shack cut him off. Leadership starts at the top. Calvin Rhodes' Shack said, his voice firm and resolute. And I can tell you, right now, the leadership in this Gerald Price needs a serious overhaul. You as a Gerald Price have a responsibility to set the standard. But you didn't. You let this happen. You let your employees treat people like this. That's unacceptable. The Gerald Price lowered his head, clearly ashamed. He had no defense, no excuse. He knew Calvin Rhodes' Shack was right. Calvin Rhodes' Shack let the moment linger. The room thick with the unspoken realization of what needed to happen next. So here's what's going to happen. Every single one of you will undergo new customer service training, and this won't be some quick seminar where you nod along and pretend to care. This is going to be real. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to make you face the biases you didn't even realize you had, because that's what change feels like. He paused, locking eyes with each employee. In turn, the training will start tomorrow, and you will all be part of it. The Gerald Price here, he'll be the first one in that room. If you can't provide respectful service to every customer that walks through these doors, then you don't belong here. It's that simple. Calvin Rhodes' Shack's voice softened just a touch, but there was no mistaking the resolve in his words. This isn't about punishment, it's about accountability. It's about ensuring that we're living up to the values that this bank was built on: integrity, respect, and equality for everyone. If you can't get on board with that, then maybe you should reconsider your place in this company. Calvin Rhodes' Shack looked at the Gerald Price, then at the Megan Porter who had dismissed him earlier. Now we're going to fix this. We're going to do better, and we're going to start today. He turned and took out his phone again, swiftly, typing out an email that would be sent to every Gerald Price across the company, a promise, a warning, a reminder of what the bank stood for and what it would no longer tolerate. As he hits send, Calvin Rhodes stood up a little straighter. The changes he had envisioned were already in motion. He could feel the shift, the awareness that was beginning to settle in among his employees. There would be no more ignoring the truth, no more overlooking the flaws in the system. Calvin Rhodes Chic had just set a precedent, one that would change everything. He walked out of the conference room, his steps confident, his mind already moving forward to the next steps. Change was here, and nothing would stop it. Not on his watch, the day after the conference, the employees of the Chicago Gerald Price gathered for their mandatory customer service training, the conference room typically filled with light-hearted chatter and the sound of coffee mugs clinking together was now unusually quiet. The usual murmur of activity was replaced with palpable tension. Every employee knew that this training was unlike any they had ever experienced before, and no one was eager to face what Calvin Rhodes had promised. Calvin Rhodes, standing at the front of the room, exuded calm authority. He was prepared for this moment not to lecture, but to ensure that every employee in this room understood exactly what was at stake. This wasn't just about making amends for one isolated incident. This was about resetting the foundation of the entire company. The culture had to change, starting now. "Good morning," Calvin Rhodes said, his voice steady but commanding. "I know that yesterday was uncomfortable for many of you. It should have been. If you're not uncomfortable with how we're treating our customers, then you're missing the point. Today we start the work of making things right." He paused for a moment, letting his words settle in. There was no place for excuses, not anymore. Calvin Rhodes had already made it clear that there would be no sweeping this under the rug. The room remained still. Eyes flicked from one another, avoiding direct eye contact. No one dared to speak. Everyone knew that this training wasn't just a formality, it was the beginning of a transformation, one that would require each and every person to examine their own biases, behaviors, and attitudes. Calvin Rhodes took a deep breath and opened the presentation. A series of slides flickered on the screen, detailing customer complaints that had been gathered over the past several months. He went through them one by one, pointing out the common threads in the complaints: dismissive behavior, ignoring customers, or offering subpar service simply based on appearances or assumptions about the person's worth. He could see the reactions in the room. Some employees were uncomfortable shifting in their seats. Others had their arms crossed defensively, but Calvin Rhodes knew they would have to face this head on. The truth couldn't be avoided anymore. Every complaint you see on these slides, Calvin Rhodes continued, is a failure of service, a failure of empathy, and a failure of the core values we claim to stand for. These are not just numbers on a report. These are real people, customers who came to us for help and were dismissed, ignored, or made to feel like they weren't good enough. Calvin Rhodes locked eyes with the Megan Porter, who had dismissed him the day before. The woman who had been so quick to roll her eyes and sigh in response to his request for help now shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Calvin Rhodes could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on her. He didn't need to say anything more for her to understand that this wasn't about a reprimand. It was about change. "You all have a role to play in fixing this." Calvin Rhodes said, "Every customer that walks through these doors deserves to feel valued. No matter what they look like or how they dress. And if you can't provide that, then you will no longer be a part of this company." There was a long silence after Calvin Rhodes' words. The room felt dense, every breath hanging in the air. Calvin Rhodes wasn't interested in quick fixes or easy answers. He wanted the truth. He wanted to hear from the employees. He wanted to know if they understood the importance of what was happening. "Do any of you want to speak up?" Calvin Rhodes asked, his voice softer but no less firm. "If you're, uncomfortable with what's being asked of you, if you don't understand the impact of your actions, now is the time to speak, because if you don't understand, then you won't be able to change. And if you can't change, then maybe you shouldn't be here." The room was silent. No one spoke up. Calvin Rhodes watched them, his eyes scanning their faces. Some were clearly ashamed, others still defensive, but none of them had the courage to voice any objections. Calvin Rhodes had made it clear that this was no longer a question of comfort. It was about doing what was right. The challenge had been laid down, and now they were all forced to face it all right. Calvin Rhodes Shock said, breaking the silence. Then we'll begin the next part of today's training. You will all participate in role-playing scenarios designed to address the issues we've discussed. You'll be working with each other to understand the perspective of the customer and how to better respond to situations that may have previously felt uncomfortable or unfamiliar. As he set the stage for the exercises, Calvin Rhodes Shock felt a growing sense of determination within him. This was just the beginning. The changes wouldn't be instantaneous, but this was the first step, a necessary step. He knew that the work ahead would be hard, but he also knew that the foundation of the company could only be rebuilt if they were willing to face the uncomfortable truths. Calvin Rhodes Shock's voice grew stronger as he spoke. I'm not going to let anyone walk into this bank and feel like they don't belong. I don't care what they look like or where they come from. Every customer deserves respect, and if you can't give them that respect, then you don't deserve to work here with that. The room went quiet again, but this time there was a shift. The discomfort was still present, but there was something more, an understanding. Slowly, the employees began to nod. The process of change had started, and they all knew it. In the following days, Calvin Rhodes Shock made sure that the training sessions were just the beginning, the audit was completed, and more complaints surfaced, painting a picture of a toxic culture that had been festering in the bank for months, even years. Calvin Rhodes Shock was not going to let this go. He called for further evaluations across the organization, bringing in specialists to work with every Gerald Price. The first round of follow-up evaluations showed progress, but it wasn't enough. Calvin Rhodes Shock knew it would take time for the new culture to truly take hold, but he couldn't afford to be patient with anyone who resisted change. He made it clear to all of his staff no one was exempt. Those who continued to show resistance or a lack of understanding about the bank's new direction were given clear choices, either adapt or leave. It wasn't just about improving service. It was about respecting customers, employees, and the community they served. Calvin Rhodes Shock knew the only way to ensure lasting change was to hold people accountable for their actions, and if that meant parting ways with employees who couldn't adjust their mindset, then that's what would happen. Calvin Rhodes Shock continued to personally visit branches, ensuring that each location followed the new guidelines, scrutinizing every detail of customer service. His leadership sent a clear message. This bank was changing, and anyone unwilling to change with it was no longer welcome. In the end, the training wasn't just about learning how to smile and greet customers. It was about understanding the deep-seated biases that had affected the company's ability to serve its clients in the most equitable way possible. This process of self-examination was painful for many, but Calvin Rhodes Shock had no other choice but to ensure that the transformation was deep and lasting. And with that, the foundation for a new era for Calvin Rhodes Shock Bank had been laid, one built on respect, empathy, and accountability. The road ahead would be challenging, but the bank was no longer just a financial institution. It was a company that understood the power of respect, the importance of change, and the weight of responsibility. It held the weeks following the training were filled with intense scrutiny and change. Calvin Rhodes Shock knew that real transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a process, a gradual evolution. The days were long as he visited Gerald Price, Gerald Price closely monitoring the implementation of the new customer service guidelines, but there was a subtle shift in the air. The tension that had once lingered around the branches began to dissipate, replaced by a new sense of accountability and awareness. The employees were beginning to understand that the culture they had helped foster could no longer be sustained. The early mornings were still quiet, but there was a change in how the bank's employees interacted with each other and with customers. Smiles became more genuine, conversations flowed more naturally, and the sense of dismissal that had previously existed was gradually replaced with patience and understanding. Calvin Rhodes Shock had set a high bar, and though it wasn't perfect, the improvements were undeniable. Calvin Rhodes Shack's regular visits to branches continued, but he no longer felt the need to go undercover. He could see the change happening, even if it was subtle. The small things made the difference: an employee offering to walk a customer through the process, a Megan Porter actively listening, instead of tapping away at their phone, a Linda Keene who greeted each person with warmth, regardless of their appearance. But even with these improvements, Calvin Rhodes Shack knew that this was only the beginning. The real work wasn't about the immediate changes. It was about sustaining them, creating a culture that could endure for the long haul, the training, the internal audits, the performance reviews. Those were all important tools. But Calvin Rhodes Shack had learned something critical through this experience. Real change comes from within. It comes from a shift in mindset, a commitment to doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. The day came when Calvin Rhodes Shack sat down with his senior leadership team, the very people who had helped him build the bank into what it had become. It was a small, intimate meeting, and the stakes were high. He had made it clear to them that the changes needed to be reflected in every layer of the bank, from the frontline employees to the executive board. It couldn't be just a surface-level change. It had to be woven into the fabric of the organization itself. He looked around the room at the faces of the senior leaders, all of whom had worked with him for years. They had helped shape the company's culture for better or worse, and now it was time for them to put their money where their mouth was. Calvin Rhodes Shack's gaze was steady as he spoke. "We've made progress. We've addressed the issues, we've held ourselves accountable. And we've made sure that every employee understands what's expected of them, but we can't stop here. This is just the beginning." The room was quiet as Calvin Rhodes Shack continued. "We need to do more than just react to complaints. We need to proactively build a culture of respect, inclusivity, and empathy. That means changing how we hire, how we train, and how we recognize and reward our employees. If we don't make that commitment, if we don't ensure that our values are reflected in every action we take, then all the progress we've made so far will be for nothing." Calvin Rhodes Shack paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. It was a turning point for the company, a point where they could either choose to follow through on the promises they'd made or allow the changes to fade over time. He looked at each leader in the room, their faces reflecting the seriousness of the moment. "From now on every decision we make will be informed by the core values that we've outlined. And if we don't live up to those values, if any of us fail to live up to them, then it's not just the employees who will be held accountable. It's all of us." The leaders nodded in agreement, and Calvin Rhodes Shack could sense that they understood the weight of what he was saying. This wasn't just about changing how the employees behaved. It was about changing the very essence of the company. They needed to lead by example, and they couldn't afford to let the company slide back into old habits. As the meeting concluded, Calvin Rhodes Shack knew that the road ahead was still long, but the foundation for lasting change had been laid. The new era for the bank had begun, and there was no turning back. The company had learned a hard lesson, but it was one that would shape its future for the better. Calvin Rhodes Shack made one final promise to himself and to his team. "We won't forget the lessons we've learned here. We'll keep pushing for better, because that's what our customers deserve, and that's what this company deserves." The shift in mindset wasn't just a moment, it was a movement. The employees now understood that customer service wasn't a transactional experience. It was a relationship built on trust and respect, and Calvin Rhodes Shack had ensured that his bank would never go back to the way it was before. Months later, when Calvin Rhodes Shack stood in front of the company's annual shareholders meeting, he felt a deep sense of pride, not just in the financial growth of the bank, but in the cultural transformation it had undergone. The complaints had decreased significantly, and customer satisfaction was at an all-time high. But more importantly, the employees were engaged. They were proud of the work they were doing, and they understood the significance of their role in creating an institution built on respect. Calvin Rhodes Shack knew the work was far from done. There would always be challenges, always be areas for improvement. But as he looked out at the sea of faces in the room, he felt confident that the company had found its true north. They were on the right path, and no matter the obstacles ahead, they would continue moving forward together. And so the story of Calvin Rhodes Bank became more than just a tale of financial success. It became a story of redemption, of accountability, and of the power of change. The road ahead as Calvin Rhodes stood in front of his employees and shareholders, reflecting on the journey the bank had undergone, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of accomplishment. The transformation was far from complete, but it was undeniable the bank had grown stronger, more inclusive, and more dedicated to serving its customers with the respect and care they deserved. The hard lessons had been learned, and now it was time to continue building on that foundation. But Calvin Rhodes knew that real change doesn't happen by resting on past successes. It happens through continuous effort, self-awareness, and holding each other accountable every day. The lessons learned in the past months had forever reshaped the culture of his bank, and that transformation was something worth celebrating. It was a testament to the hard work of the employees, the leadership team, and the customers who trusted them. But Calvin Rhodes also knew this. The journey wasn't over as the meeting came to a close. Calvin Rhodes stood in front of the podium, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "What we've accomplished here is just the beginning," he said, looking out over the audience. "But to keep this momentum going, we need to stay committed. We need to keep pushing ourselves to be better. We can't stop now." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. "And we need your support. As we continue this journey, we ask for your feedback, your suggestions, and your ideas. This is a team effort, and together we will keep growing with that." Calvin Rhodes' voice softened just a bit. "So if you believe in the work we're doing, if you believe that respect should be the foundation of everything we do, don't just watch, get involved. Like this video, follow us on our journey, share your thoughts, we want to hear from you." The call to action was clear. Change starts with engagement. Calvin Rhodes knew that every customer, every employee, every person who supported the bank's new direction played a crucial role in ensuring that the transformation continued. So if you're excited about what's coming, hit that like button. And don't forget to follow us. Stay connected, because this is only the beginning. Together, we'll make sure this story keeps going. Thank you. The room erupted in applause, and as Calvin Rhodes walked off the stage, he felt a sense of pride not just in the success they had achieved, but in the community. They were building a community of change, respect, and forward momentum. And remember, this story is yours too. Follow and be a part of the change. And just like that, a routine visit turned into a wake-up call for an entire institution. Calvin Rhodes didn't raise his voice, didn't demand special treatment. He simply revealed the truth. And in doing so, he exposed something we all need to confront. Are we truly treating people based on who they are or how they appear? This wasn't just about poor customer service. It was about prejudice hiding behind a counter. Some say Calvin should have fired the entire staff on the spot. Others believe giving them a chance to change was the real act of leadership. But what do you think? Was Calvin too forgiving, or was his approach exactly what our world needs more of? Drop your opinion in the comments. Like this video if it made you think. And follow me so I'll have more motivation to create powerful stories like this. Or just hit the number 1 and let me know you're with me.